but whether it intends to do so is not known. This Psyduck is a male and possesses the ability, Damp. Its moveset is comprised of the following: Scratch, Tail Whip, Water Gun and Fury Swipes. It also has access to the hidden Psychic-type moves, Confusion and Disable. Unfortunately, as with all Psyduck, it can only use these moves when under extreme mental duress that activates the aforementioned psychic abilities. After the handheld Pokémon encyclopedia was finished giving the details of Psyduck to the listening trainers, Giselle looked at the small yellow Pokémon and shrugged. That actually isn't a bad list of moves and Damp is a good ability. Misty nodded in agreement but then sighed. Yeah, but even his normal moves are basically worthless if we can't get these darn headaches under control. Ash put the Pokédex away and nodded as well. Right, so let's start thinking up ways to help him. With that, all three of them began doing some deep thinking over what possible solution they could try to cure Psyduck's headache condition. Eventually, Misty snapped her fingers and smiled. I've got it. Why don't we try doing a hot and cold compress? You know, like you do with a sore muscle, and the brain is a muscle after all. Giselle looked at the other girl and smiled as well. That's a good idea, Misty, and it just might work too. Ash apparently agreed and ran off to get his black and red backpack from over at the sitting log where all the others were at. Yeah, we'll try it. I think I've got some in the med supply kit in my pack. A short time later, they had a warm compress sitting on a rock near the fire to get hot while Ash was down by the river, dunking the cold one in the cool water to get chilled. However, when he didn't get it as cold as he wanted, Ash pulled it from the water and frowned before an idea struck him. Hey, I know. He then looked back to where all of his Pokémon were resting with the others after eating. V, will you come over here for a second please? The cute little fox-like Pokémon flicked his ears upward when he heard Ash's voice and then stood up before running over to him. When he arrived at his side, the boy looked down at the special little Eevee and asked. Hey V, could you change into Vaporeon please and use a low-powered Aurora Beam on this compress to get it cold? Blinking at the strange command, V tilted his head but did as requested anyway. V. He then jumped back and focused on his water-type form before beginning to change. As the white flaming light of evolution started to overtake him, V began morphing and shifting in shape and size before, in mere seconds, he was presented in the graceful, sleek form of Vaporeon. VA. He barked while Ash put the compress on the ground and then stepped back. Okay V, let it rip. Focusing on the small object in front of him, V opened his mouth and formed a much smaller ball of multicolored, freezing cold energy in it than he normally would. All of his power control training now being put to the test. Then, with a vocalized, "Bah!" he shot a small beam of ice-type energy at the compress. Ash quickly held out his hand to stop his Pokémon after only a few seconds and then carefully reached out to touch the compress. Finding it cold to his liking, he smiled and picked it up. Thanks V, that's good. He then ran back over to the campfire where Misty, Giselle and Psyduck were waiting with V following behind, changing back to normal on the way. Alright guys, here, let's try this. He then went up to Psyduck and held the compress out to the duck. Psyduck, we're gonna try and help you get over your headaches. Will you let me try this? Psyduck looked up at Ash and blinked for a moment or two before giving a simple nod in reply. Having been given permission, the boy knelt down and gently placed the cold compress on the yellow water bird's head. This might be a little cold Psyduck, just bear with it at first. He warned as he carefully situated the compress onto the Pokémon's head. Although, if Psyduck felt the cold, he certainly didn't show it and just stared blankly ahead as usual. Okay, now we wait a few minutes and try the warm compress. The young Ketchum sighed as he sat down on the big rock with Giselle and Misty that was near the fire pit. Hope this works, the brunette said as she put her hands on her chin and looked at Psyduck. After about 10 minutes of boring nothing, Ash stood back up and removed the now less cold compress from Psyduck's stationary head before moving over to the fire pit and grabbing the one that had been heating up near the fire. Finding the temperature satisfactory but not too hot, he went back up to Psyduck and laid it upon his head before taking his seat next to the girls again. Once more, the waiting game ensued and for another 10 minutes, all they did was wait. Finally though, when time was up, Ash removed the compress from Psyduck's head and then knelt down and looked at the water Pokémon intently. He was quickly joined by an anxious-looking Misty and Giselle. So, how do you feel, Psyduck? Is the headache gone? There was silence that met the question for a few moments before Psyduck placed his hands back to his head and quacked. Sigh. Psyduck sigh. Sighing, Misty stood up and frowned. I'm no Pokémon whisperer, but I think that's a no. Ash sighed as well and sat back on the ground with the compress in his hand. Well, it was at least worth a shot. Guess back to the drawing board. Giselle, whom had been very thoughtful for a time, suddenly gasped and smacked her right fist into her left palm. Oh, I might have an idea. The other two looked at her and Ash sat forward. Really? What is it? The pretty brunette only winked and waved her finger at him. Oh, you'll see. I think this will work perfectly. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX water type sitting between her legs on the ground. Her fingers, meanwhile, were busily and thoroughly rubbing, kneading and massaging Psyduck's skin through the soft, feathery down that covered his body. As she gave the small, bipedal duck a very deep tissue massage into his upper back, shoulders and even his head, Ash and Misty stood around her looking somewhat confused. Really? The younger girl questioned with a disbelieving eyebrow quirk. You think a massage will make Psyduck's headache go away? Giselle shot the orange-haired gym leader a look and retorted back. Yes, in fact, I do. She then focused on digging her fingers in deeply to Psyduck's shoulders while grunting in effort. I used to get massages all the time with my mom and sisters. Psyduck remained unfazed and still as stone while Giselle massaged him. The only movement was the slight rocking his body did as she put more force into her movements. You see. She stopped the deep tissue massage for a moment and just focused on gently and softly rubbing her fingers across Psyduck's scalp in a light scratching motion. Muscles can carry tension and stress deep down in the fibers. The stress can be emotional, physical or mental, but the results a lot of times are the same. Stress and tension in the body can lead to pain, illness, injury and even mental ailments, like headaches. She then started to press her fingers into certain points all along the front, side and back of Psyduck's head. She also did the same to his neck, shoulders and back, all while breathing deeply with her eyes closed. I learned from getting massages with my mom and sisters. She began while switching from pressing into Psyduck's muscles, releasing the pressure, lightly rubbing the area and then pressing into the same spot again. All while only using her thumbs to move them in mostly a clockwise circle when rubbing. That getting massages to release and relieve the muscles of stress doesn't just feel good, it can also help heal your body of a lot of ailments. There are also pressure points in people and Pokemon's bodies that can affect all kinds of different functions in the body, and with the right kind of stimulation, you can manipulate those points to relieve pain, cure illness and just alleviate stressful tension. She opened her eyes again and went back to deeply working Psyduck's muscles under his downy feathers while sweating at the brow from the effort it took. That's why deep tissue massages are so great, they can really stimulate those pressure points and the muscles around them. I always loved how relaxed and rejuvenated massages made me feel, and a lot of times they even helped make me feel better if I was feeling bad. So this might help with Psyduck's headaches too. Misty still appeared a little skeptical, but Ash just shrugged. Makes sense. I know if my mom had a headache and I rubbed her neck for her, or if her feet hurt and I rubbed them, it would usually always help make her feel better. This could work too, I suppose. They continued to wait for Giselle to finish her massage, and then, once she was finally done, she just sat back and panted while looking at Psyduck. There. How do you feel now, Psyduck? The sitting duck remained quiet for a time, motionless still, before he finally turned his head and looked back at them. When he did, his hands went up to his head once more and he blinked. Sigh. Duck. At that, Giselle fell flat back in defeated exasperation while Ash and Misty smiled slightly and sweat dropped at the forehead. Well, Ash began. At least his muscles are loose enough for some training if we ever get his headaches under control. Misty finished with thin eyes. Hey, Brock suddenly spoke as he walked up while wiping his hands off on a rag. The stew is on now, so maybe I might be able to give a possible solution. Yeah. Ash and Misty both questioned together while Giselle sat up and tiredly looked at the older teen. Go for it, she sighed with throbbing arms. I'm dead tired and all out of ideas. A gleam came to Brock's perpetually squinty eyes as he smirked and replied confidently. Oh, trust me, I all but guarantee this will work. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Ah. Brock, are you so sure this is a good idea? Misty called up in concern to her friend, whom was currently standing high up in a tree on a big branch near the campsite. Yeah, I agree, Brock, this really doesn't look safe. Giselle agreed without a second's hesitation. Don't be silly, I'm all but willing to bet my best cooking pot that this will work. The eldest of the Stone siblings yelled back as he stood on the branch with Ash beside of him and Psyduck in between them. I don't know, Brock. The younger boy said in slight nervousness as he stared at the ground, a long way down. This seems kind of crazy, even to me. Looking at the one whom had helped get Psyduck up the tree, Brock smiled and knelt next to the small Pokémon. Don't worry, Ash, I'm training to be a Pokémon breeder, remember? I read about this in one of my books once. Ash glanced down at his friend with a raised eyebrow while holding onto the tree with one hand to make sure he didn't accidentally slip and fall. Was it a book on Pokémon headache relief or the best way to become a quadriplegic? Ignoring his younger friend, Brock looked at Psyduck and explained. I read that going with gravity by suspended inversion, or hanging upside down for prolonged periods of time, can help to relieve spinal pressure and thereby headaches too. The book said that, theoretically, the practice could work on Pokémon and people alike. Ash blinked down at him before deadpanning. And why can this not be done down on the ground, safely? The other boy looked up at him and smiled. Well, because it also said that the higher up you were when upside down, the more force gravity had to pull down on your spine. The trainer hoping to enter the Indigo conference just sighed. I really hope you're right and that book wasn't just written by some nut. Brock decided at that time to try his idea and looked back at Psyduck. Okay, so here's what I'm gonna do, Psyduck. I am going to grab you and then very carefully lift you upside down. Hopefully this will work and you won't have these really bad headaches anymore. The blank-looking waterfowl just looked at Brock before tilting his head, a seemingly very common thing for him to do. Sigh. With all of that said, the brown-haired teen grabbed Psyduck around the middle and then stood up while holding him carefully. Then, just as carefully, he slowly began turning the Pokémon he now held around until Psyduck was soon turned completely upside down in his grasp. Soon enough, Brock was in the position he had earlier projected in his mind, with Psyduck being held carefully in his arms while inverted totally upside down. Brock had him out over the branch too, so essentially, if he happened to slip and fall, well, here was to hoping that Psyduck could spontaneously learn to fly. Oh boy. Misty's voice was full of dread as she watched the precarious sight above them while Giselle stood nervously beside her. Something tells me this is going to end up very badly. As they stood up atop the tree branch and time continued to lapse on by, Brock asked of the Pokémon he was holding upside down. So Psyduck, how are you feeling? Headache gone? Showing that he would have done wonderfully as a test dummy since Psyduck hadn't so much as moved once yet, he blinked a time or two before quacking back. Sigh, duck duck. Before Brock could think to reply though, he and Ash suddenly felt the gut-lurching sensation of the tree limb dropping down slowly. That was immediately followed by the faint but heart-stopping sound of wood cracking and splintering. Feeling his belly turn to ice, Ash turned his head around, almost as if in slow motion, and reluctantly looked back at the base of the limb. Seeing a deep, dangerous crack forming in the wood, his eyes widened and his heart all but halted completely. Brock. He spoke slowly while reaching his hands out hesitantly and timidly for anything else at all to grab onto. Knowing what was happening, the teenager in question swallowed a deep lump in his throat while sweat broke out on his brow. Yeah, Ash. There was another nasty crack, this one louder. I just wanted you to know before we die. Ash closed his eyes and prepared for the worst. This was a really, really bad idea. The other boy would have nodded in agreement, but he was too scared stiff to move. Down on the ground, the two girls were panicking. What do we do? What do we do? Giselle fretted. I don't know. Misty yelled back in despair. If we try to help, the branch might break completely. Up on the branch itself, both Ash and Brock were precariously positioning their weight in such a way that it didn't add any more strain to the already weakened branch. Brock was still holding Psyduck upside down, but as they waited for the break and inevitable fall to come at any time, it never did. Peeking an eye open, Ash looked and saw they were still aloft. Which caused him to sigh in shaky relief. Maybe it won't break after all. Brock nodded nervously, but at that very same time, they both saw a Pidgey suddenly fly in and flutter close to the branch as it looked for a place to perch itself. Seeing this, both of their eyes widened and Ash called out urgently to it. No. No, Pidgey. Please no, don't land on this branch. Brock, for his part, nodded fervently and looked back. Yeah, right over there is an even better branch. Please go over there, don't land here. The small bird continued to flutter and flap its wings as it stared at the two fretting humans. However, instead of heeding their warnings, it just descended down and perched neatly upon the very edge of the branch. No. Ash, Brock and the two girls on the ground all yelled in tandem, fully expecting the branch to give way at any second. Fate apparently liked playing with their emotions though, because even with Pidgey's added weight, it still held. Seeing this, Ash and Brock, along with the two girls, sighed in relief again. Man. The black-haired boy panted. If the fall doesn't kill me, then all this excitement will give me a heart attack. Brock nodded as he sweated at the brow, his arms getting tired from holding up Psyduck but not daring to so much as shift 1 inch. Soon, the same Pidgey eventually took off into the air again, which had the two boys sharing a look of relief between them before nervous laughs escaped their lips. The laughter was abruptly cut short, unfortunately, when the branch finally snapped free of the tree trunk and let go. For a split second, it was like time slowed and gave Ash and Brock just enough of a moment to realize what was happening. Sadly, that also came with the sickening drop in their stomach that followed just before both of them went crashing to the ground along with the big branch. Misty and Giselle could only look on in terror, the former gasping and the latter screaming and covering her eyes. As the branch hit the earth and a cloud of leaves shot up into the air from the impact, the two boys lay groaning on the ground in pain. Ash was laying back against the branch with his arms tossed up over it, and Brock was kneeling butt up on the grass a short ways away. His elevated arms were holding Psyduck up just enough off the ground to keep from hitting his head. I think I broke my butt. The tracksuit wearing trainer coughed as he reveled in the sensation of not being dead. Yeah, well, I think I broke my stomach. Brock wheezed back as he lay where he was, his stomach throbbing in pain from the impact of the hard ground. Seeing both boys were alive and seemingly okay, Misty and Giselle ran up to them in a panic. Ash. Brock. Are you both okay? The former called out as she ran up to them and stopped near Brock while Giselle ran over to help Ash up. Well, okay is a pretty vague term. The aforementioned young man in question groaned as his girlfriend helped him to slowly stand and then worriedly looked him over. Does feeling like you just got run over by a stampede of toros pass for okay? Or hit in the gut by a Hitmonchan? Brock grunted as he stood up as well after Misty took Psyduck from him. Are you okay, Psyduck? The Cerulean City gym leader asked in concern for the portly water bird she now held in her arms. Looking up at Misty as if nothing had just happened, Psyduck only blinked at her and replied with a nasally Psy-I-duck. Well. Ash walked over with a slight bend in his spine, which he tried to correct with Giselle's help as he kept attempting to stand up straight. I wanna know how his headache feels. Yes, Psyduck, tell us, do you feel any better? Brock asked hopefully as he rubbed his stomach. As with the other times, the water type in question merely looked at him and tilted his head to the side while his hands moved back up to cradle it again. Knowing what that meant, all of them sighed and hung their heads, Brock most of all. Well, so much for that idea. Sorry guys. Ash, whom had managed to stand up straight again, looked at Psyduck and frowned in deep thought. Man, there's just gotta be a way to do something. Giselle put her hands on her hips and sighed. I know you want to help Ash and it would make a big difference in Psyduck's training, but you're trying to fight nature. His species naturally battle with headaches until evolution. It isn't like you can just go inside of his head and take them away. At her words, an idea suddenly struck Ash like one of Pikachu's thunderbolts as he turned to look at her with wide eyes. Say that again, Giselle. What you just said, say it again. Blinking in confusion, she slowly repeated herself. I said it isn't like you can just go inside of Psyduck's head and take away the headaches. Smiling brightly, he turned around and held his arms out. Aha. Yes, of course. That's it. I think I know how to get rid of Psyduck's headaches now. His friends looked at him all oddly, with Misty being the first to speak. And, how do you expect to do that? Turning his grinning visage to her, he pointed at the Pokémon in her arms. Psyduck gets really bad headaches because the psychic power inside of him just can't be controlled yet, right? She nodded to his somewhat rhetorical question, not really understanding what he was getting at. Well, if Psyduck suffers from headaches, which takes place in his head and is being caused by untapped psychic energy, then why not use psychic power to get rid of his headaches? All three of his friends appeared equally at a loss as to what he was getting at, and Giselle narrowed her eyes a bit to show her confusion. I don't understand, Ash. What are you talking about? Misty nodded in agreement. Yeah, how can you use psychic energy to alleviate Psyduck's headaches? Especially if his own dormant psychic power is causing them. Brock crossed his arms. And it's not as if any of us are necessarily psychics like Sabrina. But even if we were, we saw firsthand how dangerous powers like that can be. I'm not so sure how safe meddling around in someone's head with psychic abilities really is. You could really hurt them. The boy with the Z marks on his cheeks merely shook his head and endeavored to explain his plan. No, guys, listen. If we had a Pokémon with psychic power go into Psyduck's head and maybe I don't know, place a barrier or something around the part of his brain that is causing the headaches, it should stop them. He walked up to Misty, whom still held Psyduck, and pointed at the rotund duck's head. The part of a Pokémon's brain that allows the use of psychic-type moves obviously exists in Psyduck, since he in his evolved form, Golduck, can use them too. So we know his headaches aren't stemming from natural causes like with normal Pokémon and people. Ash turned to look at Giselle and Brock. That also means that his headaches are probably centered around one particular area in the brain. If we had a psychic Pokémon use their powers on Psyduck and go into his head, they might be able to place a protective cocoon of sorts around that part of the brain. It would still allow the rest of it to work and function normally, but that part of the brain in particular would have a barrier of psychic energy around it to keep out the headaches. The other three appeared to be in a mutual state of surprise, amazement, and still even a bit of perplexity. Though, it was Brock that spoke on the matter first. Well, okay, Ash, that might work. But you have to consider doing something like that carefully, because even if it worked, putting a barrier of another Pokémon's psychic energy on Psyduck's brain could be dangerous. Or at the very least it could stunt his own psychic growth by blocking off that part of his brain. His younger friend nodded. Yeah, I know. But I was thinking on calling back home and talking to Ghastly about doing it. He has the ability to use really strong psychic type moves, and he's good at it too. That, and he also has good control. I mean, he made those psychic disguises for us and they worked really well. His three friends shared a look amongst each other, but Giselle eventually shrugged and dropped her shoulders. It's worth a try, I guess. What else do we have to lose? Misty looked down at Psyduck and then nodded. Yeah, I don't want Psyduck to continue suffering with headaches, even if it is technically normal for his species. After what Ghastly did for us, I trust him to at least try. Alright, awesome. He smiled at his slightly older female friend and gestured at the X-transceiver on his right wrist. I'll go sit by the fire and make the call to the lab. If any of you wanna join in with me, feel free. Giselle followed her boyfriend as he started making his way back to the campsite. I'll go with you, maybe we'll get to talk to Salia. Me too. Misty took up the rear while still holding Psyduck in her arms. Brock, though, for his part, spun around and snapped to attention. Crap. I need to check my stew. He then ran off to the fire, where he had a large pot suspended above it by two portable roasting poles that he always carried in his pack. As the oldest of their group tended to the bubbling pot of vegetable berry stew, Ash sat down on the same rock from earlier next to it. He was soon joined by Misty and Giselle on either side of him, the former placing Psyduck between her legs. looking up as they heard Brock give a loud announcement of, "It's okay. Stu is fine." Ash and the two girls smiled in amusement before he turned his attention to his X-transceiver and prepared to make the call home. A few seconds later, the semi-large screen on the portable tech device was lit up with the outgoing call symbol as it rang. Then, after about 5 rings, the screen shifted from black to an image of Salia's face, whom was sitting in front of the video chat computer in the main room of the lab. As soon as she saw them, the chocolate-haired teenager smiled brightly and greeted the trio happily. "Hi guys. How are you?" "Hey Salia." Ash waved at her and then had to make room as Misty and Giselle moved their faces in front of his. "Hi Salia, it's so good to see you. How are you fitting in at Pallet Town?" The only male in the call had to force his head back into the camera's view and Salia giggled at the excitement of the ones she had come to see as friends. "It's going great, really great. Professor Oak has been teaching me a lot and I've been really happy working with the Pokémon too. Getting to be around my old Butterfree every day is a huge plus as well and Ash's mom is so nice." The boy with the mother in question blinked at that. "Did you just say my mom?" Salia nodded, still smiling. "Yep. I've been going to visit her a lot and she is so sweet and nice. Your mom is also a fantastic cook Ash, I almost feel bad for you that you aren't able to have any of it right now." His stomach growled as she said that. A reminder of his hunger and also the thought of his mother's home cooking. Although, he managed to hide it well as he smiled and rubbed the back of his head. "Well, that's awesome Salia, I'm glad to know you're fitting in so well. Hey, is Ghastly around by any chance? I'd really like to talk to him if I can." The brunette glanced over her shoulder into the lab and then looked back at the computer monitor. "Yeah, I think so actually." She then smiled in amusement. He and Professor Oak were working on poetry earlier so he should still be here. "Give me a minute and I'll check." She then got up and disappeared from view for a time. Ash, Misty and Giselle waited for about 5 minutes or so and then finally, she returned to the screen. "Hey. Sorry about the wait guys, I found him. He was just finishing up doing a new haiku with the professor and I didn't want to bother them. Here he is." She then moved out of the way as the gaseous form of the ever-grinning Ghastly filled the screen. "Why if it isn't my great and fearless trainer, Ash Ketchum." The dramatic-sounding ghost type shifted his gaze to the two girls with him. "And the beautiful Lady Giselle and ravishing Mistress Misty. Isn't this a pleasant surprise? How may I be of assistance?" Ash and the girls sitting on either side of him smiled at the spectral comedian's exuberant greeting but their eyes were soon drawn to the blue, floral print robe Ghastly was wearing. Ash pointed and fought back a laugh. "Ghastly, what are you wearing?" His Pokémon didn't even need to look as he simply let out a ringing laugh. "Oh ha ha ha. So you noticed Well, I figured that since I endeavored to join in on old Sam Oak's poetry sessions, I might as well look the part." Giselle looked like she might laugh aloud but she settled for only a small giggle. "And the robe is supposed to help with that." Ghastly winked at her and then laughed boisterously again. "Well, it certainly cannot hurt." Now, he floated a bit back away from the monitor so they could see him more clearly. "Why did you summon me? Do you need some more?" He looked conspiratorially from side to side. "Help." Before they could answer, he suddenly poofed into existence a sewing machine and a lamp hovering beside of it. "Maybe a new outfit. Disguise. Wardrobe. Fancy left sock. Speak up now, they're all half off. Or maybe you need me too." In another poof of smoke, the lively ghost type was dressed like a gangster in a black striped suit and a black brimmed hat. "Off a poor, wretched soul I work a quick and I don't tell a nobody. You pay now, halfa now and halfa later. I get the job done a good Misty looked down and fought back a laugh while Giselle giggled again. Ash only rolled his eyes in amusement while, in the background in the lab, they could hear Salia laughing. Which only fueled the big clown of a ghost type. Or maybe what you really need is. In another illusionary fashion change, Ghastly was dressed like an accountant with a green-brimmed hat and a calculator in front of him that had a mess of receipts spewing from it in large white rolls. Sound financial advice from the Ghastly and Ghastly CPU firm. The small, beetly thin glasses he wore and the half-drained coffee mug next to him only added to the theme. But act now. We have a special free consultation deal going from exactly 2.5 seconds ago until the middle of next year on the first foggy Monday of May. First person to call gets this free, one-of-a-kind, limited edition t-shirt. He then materialized a shirt into existence next to him that had the image of him grinning goofily printed onto the front. There was also a caption under it which read, "Ghastly rocks," in big white letters with smaller ones under it in the same color. The real comedy tour coming to you in coffee shops and shady back alleys everywhere. Shaking his head and allowing a few chuckles to escape his lips, Ash finally got the slapstick ghost type's attention. "Ghastly, I really do need your help with something important. That is." He looked away and grinned in a way that he knew would grab Ghastly's focus immediately. "If you think you can, it might be too hard even for you." "Oh ho. I think not," the loud and soulful ghost Pokémon announced passionately. "Nothing is too hard for my mighty ghostly powers. Why, I can move any mountain, drain any ocean and slip a banana peel under any heel. You just tell me what it is and I'll do it for only half the rate I usually charge on the days when I rate up my rates." Chuckling once again at his own poor choice of joke and word usage, Ghastly became a little more serious, if that was even a word he knew, and focused on his much younger trainer. "But, for the sake of my valiant and stout-hearted trainer, I might just do it for free. Now tell me what the new mission is, oh mighty captain." Becoming serious, Ash undertook to explain the situation with Psyduck and his inquiry as to whether or not Ghastly could do what he had planned to help the water type. By the time he was done, the hybrid Pokémon was surprisingly silent for a short time before eventually, he spoke. Albeit, somewhat slowly, as if trying to decide what to say. "I suppose, it could be possible, yes." He gave a small forward nod of his gaseous body but then became unusually serious. "Though your friends are right, Ash. Using psychic power to manipulate anyone's mind can be very risky, whether it be human or Pokémon." He then looked at Psyduck via the screen and narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. "I do understand why you wish to do this. I am going to say that it may be possible for me but only because I have so many years of experience manipulating psychic energy. However, it will take time and I request that you either send Psyduck here or bring me to you so that I can work out how it will need to be done first." His tone actually became grave and serious. Horrible things can happen if one meddles with the brain and is inadequately prepared. I will need to study and examine Psyduck for a time and gently probe his mind with my powers before I attempt to do what you are asking. Ash nodded and then looked at Misty. "Would you be okay if I sent Psyduck to the lab for a while so Ghastly can do what he needs to do?" His first friend that he had met on his journey gave a small, firm nod. "If you think this will be best, Ash, then I trust you. We're training Psyduck together and the fact remains that if he can't get over these headaches, not only will he keep suffering but we won't ever be able to train with him until he evolves. And that will take an extremely long time if we can't train him to get stronger." She then looked down at the Pokémon in her lap. "Psyduck, you heard what Ash and Ghastly were talking about but it's your decision. Do you want to go stay with him and Ash's other Pokémon for a while so he can maybe help get rid of your headaches?" The pot-bellied duck looked at the screen of Ash's X-transceiver and then back up at her before, surprisingly, he actually gave a coherent response. With a nod of his head, he gave his answer. "Psyduck." Giselle raised her eyebrows. "Wow, I guess he wants to get over his headaches just as much as we want to help him." With that decided, Ash looked back at the screen and nodded. "Thanks, Ghastly, I trust you and know you'll do your best. Can I talk to Salia again please?" Ghastly nodded and then shifted away from the monitor so the brunette young woman could take over the call again. "So what do you need from me, Ash?" Gesturing at Psyduck, he explained. "You heard what we talked about. I'm gonna send Psyduck to you for Misty and just tell Professor Oak what we're doing please. I know he won't have any issues with it but I still want him to know." She nodded as he finished speaking. "Of course, I understand. Just send him over and I'll take care of it on my end." Smiling in gratitude, Ash thanked her and Ghastly once again before saying goodbye, along with Misty and Giselle. Then, as soon as the call was ended, Misty went over to her bag and grabbed Psyduck's Pokeball before kneeling down and smiling. "Okay Psyduck, you take care and we'll see you real soon." Getting nothing but a nod from the simple-minded Pokémon, she returned him to the ball and then stood back up before handing it to Ash. Reaching to the clip on his side, Ash got out his Pokédex and opened it before placing the ball on the Pokeball-shaped teleporter pad. Then, after following the proper prompts on the lower touch screen and confirming the transfer process, the ball began glowing white before it promptly vanished. Once that was finished, he put away his Pokédex again just as he heard Brock call out. Okay. Stew's ready, let's eat. Stomach growling again, Ash smiled and ran back to his friends. Alright, I'm starving. Save a big bowl for me. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. It was late that night, almost midnight, when Ash stirred in his sleeping bag near the fire. A fire which they had all decided to keep going through the night, both for warmth and also so the outfit he habitually wore and had washed earlier that evening could get dry for the next day. Rolling over to his side, careful to not stir Pikachu or V, whom were sleeping in the bag with him on either side, Ash got up onto his elbow and rubbed his sleepy eyes. As he looked around the campsite where all of his friends and their Pokémon were sleeping close together, he took in the nighttime atmosphere that was illuminated by the soft orange glow of the fire. The young man nearly jumped though when he heard a sound near the fire, but once he looked, he saw that it was just Vulpix, whom had just finished spitting a small burst of flames onto the fire to revitalize it before padding over to Brock. With the added and rejuvenated light given off by the revived flames, he watched the fox Pokémon settle down at the foot of her trainer's sleeping bag and curl herself into a ball. Onix was sleeping in a curled-up position that almost encircled the whole campsite and everyone in it. Brock's sleeping bag was right up against Onix's rocky body and Graveler was near his head, curled into a tight ball as he slept. Which, from the current angle Ash had, made the rock-type Pokémon look like an actual big boulder and nothing else. Panning his gaze further on, he saw Zubat sleeping upside down off of Onix's chin. Misty's red and white floral patterned sleeping bag was closer to his own, and since her Pokémon were all water types, they slept in their Pokéballs. Giselle's pink sleeping bag was on the other side of Ash's, across from Misty, and she had Marowak sleeping inside of it with her. Graveler, much like Brock's, also looked like a big rock at present as he slept at the head of his trainer. The raven, messy-haired boy blinked his eyes again and then looked down at the ground right next to his sleeping bag. Almost right near his head was a small hole that he knew Diglett was sleeping down inside of. Not seeing Haunter anywhere though, Ash turned to look toward the river a short ways away and spotted the huge, black ghost type hovering near the water's edge. From where he was at, the rookie from Pallet could tell his Pokémon was watching the moon, which was hanging full and high in the sky above. Carefully slipping out of his sleeping bag, Ash quietly walked over to the river. His bare feet were padding along the wet midnight grass while he wore only his black t-shirt and a pair of black sleeping shorts. Watching the moon, huh? He said casually after arriving and standing beside the giant ghost type. Haunter saw him and cast his eyes down toward Ash before looking back up at the moon again. As per usual though, he said nothing. Getting comfortable as he sat down on the grass, ignoring the moisture that seeped into his shorts as he did so, Ash looked up at the moon again. I always used to like watching the moon when I was at home too. I still do it on the road now sometimes, but it's hard to beat the view I always had of it from the roof of my house. The rural area I live in outside of the town of Pallet has got a pretty sweet view of the wide open sky. He then tilted his head back a bit as he stared at the huge lunar sphere in the otherwise dark night sky. One that was only dotted by a few stars here and there. You know, I always found that the moon was pretty nice to stare at if you were thinking about things. Me. Ash frowned a bit and sat forward. I thought about my dad a lot. Haunter looked down at his trainer slightly as the boy continued in a low tone. I would always think about what he was like, if we had anything in common, if we acted the same and shared similar traits. I'd think about what he was doing, where he was, and if he was looking at the same moon wherever he was. Then I'd end up thinking about why he never came back home and. Ash smiled sadly as he looked down at the clear running river in front of them. I don't know. I guess sometimes I wondered if something happened to him or if he got married and had another family. Then I'd always remind myself that he was still sending mom money every month for us to live on, even though he didn't know about me. But it would still make me wonder why he never came back home. He then sighed and looked out across the river again. But nowadays, when I have time to just stop and think, I think about some of the bad things I've done. That got Hunter's attention as he looked fully down at his trainer. Ash, though, only looked up and gave a slight smile at his Pokémon. Come on, Hunter, you saw my memories when we connected the first time through the star mark, I know you did. His eyes shifted back to the water and became more serious again as his face settled into a frown. Sometimes, when I get really angry, this feeling, this energy just comes over me. It's so powerful and overwhelming, like a fire gets lit in my belly and my brain goes all fuzzy. He narrowed his gaze a little bit. When I've gotten like that and lost control, when that other presence comes over me, it's scary. I totally lose myself and feel like I'm taking a backseat in my own mind. It's like I'm being thrust out of my body and watching things happen through a really hazy fog. Drawing his knees up to his chest, Ash rested his arms on them and kept looking at the somewhat dark river current as the light from the moon reflected off of his pensive eyes. I really can't remember much during the times it's happened, but I do know I did things, really, really horrible things. I know the people I did it to technically deserved it, but still, to know you're capable of such destructive, horrific things and can't control it, it's scary. He tightened his hold on his knees. Seeing the looks on my friends' faces when I come out of it, seeing the fear and worry they had for me, then looking around and seeing what I did, it scared me. It still scares me. I think about what I'm capable of and what happens if I lose control, even one time. The solemn-faced boy looked up at the moon again. I never asked to be who I am. Arceus chosen one. I never asked for this strange other side, this energy that's inside of me. I guess I've accepted who I am, but sometimes I find myself wondering if I ever really had a choice, you know. If I could have chosen a path for myself, or if my destiny was always planned out from the time I was born, before then even. He sighed and rubbed a hand across his neck. I don't mean to sound like I'm complaining or anything, because I'm not. I have a great life and I know it. I have great Pokémon, great friends, a wonderful mom, Professor Oak and the others back home, and I feel really fortunate to be good at what I do and that Arceus herself cares about and believes in me so much. It's just, sometimes I guess it all can feel a bit overwhelming. Leaning back on his hands, he took a deep breath and released it. I know I just have to be strong and face everything that comes my way with strength and bravery. I gotta have faith Arceus is always watching over me and not think she made a huge mistake. I have to focus on being the best son, friend and trainer I can be. But yeah, it can be hard. He frowned once again, only slightly this time. I think the hardest part is just the memory thing. Knowing what I did when I lost control, never knowing if or when it'll happen again and always trying to make sure I don't let it happen anymore. I guess the scary thing is just, when it happens, when I feel that dark side taking over. He glanced back to the moon once more. Sometimes I actually like it. Some part of me, deep down, loves the feel of that kind of raw power coursing through my body. Knowing that the ones I'm directing it towards have done horrible things and are about to pay for it, it feels good. And I think that's what scares me the most. He finally looked toward Hunter again, whom was staring at him with enrapt attention. Then, smiling ever so slightly, he continued on. I think I know, better than anyone else, what you're going through, Hunter. What you've done, the feelings that come with all those bad memories, knowing what you're capable of, wanting to change but not being sure if you can, feeling like you never really had a choice to begin with. Seeing the surprise in the giant ghost type's eyes, his smile grew just a little bit. Yeah, I can empathize with all of that, Hunter. You and me are the same in a lot of ways, and I guess that's why Ash looked down and rubbed the back of his neck again. I guess that's why I want to help you so badly. I know the pain you feel, in my own way, and I want to help you overcome that. I want to help you heal because I know if you can do this, I can too. He then stood up and looked at the levitating Pokémon that once garnered such fear and despair. I know it's going to take time, Hunter, but don't ever forget, you aren't alone anymore. You have me, my other Pokemon, and everyone else. We're not just your friends, we're your family now too. And family helps one another, through thick and thin. He then smiled again, softly. You don't have to isolate yourself, Hunter. You're a part of this family now, and I love you as a member of that family. Don't forget that, okay? The young trainer turned and stretched his arms out while yawning. Well, it's super late and I'm exhausted. I think I'm gonna head back to bed now. Beginning to walk away, he suddenly stopped and then looked back at the still stunned-looking ghost type. Smiling once more, he bid his final words of the night. Good night, Hunter. I love you. Ash then went back to the campsite and crawled into his sleeping bag, leaving a shell-shocked Hunter in his wake. The young man was only in his sleeping bag for a few short minutes before he started to get heavy-eyed due to the warmth of the fire. Also, the comforting glow it gave off and the two rhythmically sleeping Pokémon next to him, Pikachu and V, helped in lulling him to sleep as well. This was just beginning to happen when he suddenly noticed a long shadow slowly settling over his sleeping bag. He didn't panic though or freak out because he could distinguish the shape of the shadow by the firelight and recognized it was Hunter. Intrigued but not moving, Ash pretended to be asleep but still watched with one eye open as the shadow slowly, hesitantly, started moving around. Even though he couldn't see what was happening, he had a good idea. Sure enough, with a slightly awkward aura around him and more than a little nervousness, Hunter had quietly ghosted over and was now right next to Ash's sleeping bag. Then, deciding to take the plunge, he started to settle himself down. Contrary to popular belief, while ghost Pokemon couldn't technically sleep in the normal sense of the word, they could go into a hibernation-like state that was very similar to sleep. From said state, they would then recharge their energy and restore themselves like sleeping did for normal people and Pokemon. At present, Hunter was settling himself down on the outside of Ash's sleeping bag. Just far enough away to be out of the direct light of the fire but still casting his shadow over the boy nonetheless. Then, as he finished situating himself until he resembled a big wall of shadow eclipsing his trainer, Hunter slowly closed his eyes and gradually went into hibernation state. Though he didn't see it, Ash could still tell what had just happened and all he could do was smile to himself as sleep finally began to take him. Before long, the content young trainer was out like a light with Hunter's shadow somehow helping to comfort him into that deep sleep. XXXXXXXXXXXX. The next morning, at almost 6 sharp, Ash and his friends were walking along a cliffside highway en route to the commercial end of Seafoam Islands. It sure is a beautiful day, Misty observed as they walked on the path reserved just for pedestrians while cars sped up and down beside of them on the road. Yeah, and it sure is getting busy, Giselle commented as she watched a car fly by. Ash, whom had Pikachu on one shoulder and V on the other, looked back. He soon found that he needed to speak up over the roar of cars on the one side of the path and the lapping of ocean waves on the other, far down below the side of the cliff. Well, we are in between Fuchsia City and the Seafoam Islands now, so I'd be surprised if traffic didn't start picking up. Brock nodded in agreement and pulled at the straps of his backpack. I'm just glad we stopped off in Fuchsia City this morning to resupply. I was running low on some of my cooking ingredients and we needed stuff to make the Pokemon's food as well. Suddenly, Giselle pointed as they rounded a bend and called out. Look! There's the bridge from the mainland to the island. Following her gaze, sure enough, she was right. Stretching across the water a short ways away, from one end of the mainland to the island across the ocean, was the massive, arched bridge that connected both points. Well, look at that! Misty exclaimed. It's so huge. And indeed it was. The bridge was a gleaming, silver symbol of human ingenuity. With massive steel columns extended down into the deep ocean water beneath and high, arching beams of finely fashioned metal above, the Seafoam Bridge was a true testament of man's inventive ability. With a spring in their step, the 4 traveling friends made their way swiftly to the bridge and then past the checkpoint. There, 2 officers were collecting tolls in 2 separate booths from the people in cars driving onto the bridge. After getting onto the pedestrian path that lead across the bridge, they started the long trek leading from the mainland to the island on the far side. Luckily enough, the road they were using was mostly free of a lot of foot traffic, which allowed them to reach the island in only about 10 minutes. Once they finally got off the bridge, the 4 Pokémon trainers immediately walked onto the road that had a sign pointing to the city located on the island. As they got onto the aforementioned road and began following it, they admired their surroundings the whole way. In fact, it was Misty that commented as they ventured further into the island's interior. "Everything is so clean, neat and well kept here." And indeed, that was true too. There was no trash to be seen littering the road or in the jungle-like terrain off to the side. The roads and footpaths themselves looked very well maintained. The trees and bushes along the path they were on appeared to be cut back, so as not to get in people's way, and even the smell of the air felt clean. "It is nice around here," Brock agreed as he looked around while they walked. "You can tell the community here on the island keeps everything nice for tourists." If they were impressed at just the roads that lead into the city, then they were soon left in astonishment as they actually came into the town of Seafoam itself, only a short while later. All the buildings and shops were neat, well painted and clean, not so much as a single abandoned establishment or shop in sight. The streets were just as clean and tidy as the roads, there were trash cans on almost every corner and the signs were all clear, straightforward and easy to read. "Look at how busy this place is," Giselle observed as she looked at all of the cars driving up and down the streets. As well as the people filling the sidewalks and just the general hustle and bustle going on all around them. "It's not really surprising this time of year when the rest of Kanto is getting hit with cold fronts," Brock began explaining as they walked up to a crosswalk near a street intersection that read Corral Avenue and Sea Line Street. "People want to get away from the winter and down here it never gets as cold." Seeing a car go by that had surfboards strapped to the top and also several people walking around that had on beach wear and other touristy outfits, Ash smiled. "I don't know, but I hope the water is warm this time of year." "It should be," the squinty-eyed teen replied. "Granted it won't be as warm as it is in the middle of summer, but it should still be comfortable." As they got onto one of the main streets that lead down through the heart of the city, the young group of travelers took in the sight of all the shops and restaurants on either side of the street, stretching for several blocks straight ahead. Not only was there a souvenir place at practically every third shop, but there were also vendors set up on the sidewalk. Each one peddling things like jewelry, beach items, clothing, seashell trinkets and other tourist apparel. They ventured through the main streets of the city for a short time, taking in the sights and sounds around them, before eventually getting onto a street that lead down to the harbor and beach access areas. As they made their way toward the outer lying rim of the island, that was when they started seeing all the homes, beach houses and even mansions that were dotted along the coast. Certain areas they passed through seemed to be designated for just normal housing, while others looked like they were meant for rental beach housing alone. Even still, when they passed through the area of the island that was reserved for the mansions and rich people, their jaws remained almost permanently agape. "Dang, talk about posh," Ash commented as they walked past a huge, white, 3-story mansion that had 3 extremely expensive cars in the driveway and a huge water fountain in the lawn. A fountain which had statues of golden Magikarp lining the basin. Misty and Brock both nodded in agreement, but Giselle remained oddly silent, awkwardly so. And even though Ash found it a little odd, he said nothing. Though, her strange attitude remained the same the entire time they went through the wealthy end of the island. After they walked past the area of the island with all the housing, they ventured through the harbor, where several boats and yachts of varying sizes and shapes were anchored at port. However, no commercial ocean liners or fishing boats were seen, save for just a few of the latter. Soon, Ash and company got closer to the beach itself and saw piers lining the waterside where passerbys, fishermen and people looking through paid telescopes were staring out over the ocean. From where they were now, Misty sighed and took a deep breath of the sea air. "Ah, I love the smell of the ocean." Giselle looked around and then hummed in thought. "I wonder if there are any public changing areas nearby. I need to get changed into my bikini." As they approached yet another crosswalk that led across the road to the sidewalk that connected to the beach itself, Ash looked around with a hand over his eyes to shield it from the sun. "Hey, over there." He pointed across the road and down on the beach where a small changing facility could be seen. I see one. With a destination in mind, they ventured across the road and down onto the beach. After going to the changing facility and finding the correct sides, the four of them separated for a time and went to change into their beachwear. Ash and Brock finished up first and came out dressed in simple trunks and nothing else. The former had simply converted his black and red track pants into the shorts trunks combo they could become by unzipping and removing the legs. Meanwhile, Brock had donned himself into a pair of dark gray trunks. As the two boys stood outside of the changing area at the front and waited on the girls, Ash stretched and enjoyed the feel of the warm sun beating down upon his slightly tanned skin. Man, this beach weather feels great. I am so ready to hit the waves. He then looked down at Pikachu and Bee in front of him and grinned. What about you two? You ready to get wet? Pikachu and Bee both chirped and yipped excited replies, but then Ash became a little thoughtful as he looked around at the crowded beach they were on. A beach which was full of people. You know, Brock, we might have to go and find a more isolated spot of beach on the island, if there is one. This place is too crowded for me to release those two from their Pokeballs and not cause a panic. Knowing exactly which two his friend was talking about, Brock looked around and then nodded in agreement. Yeah, you're right. If you did it here, everyone would run screaming from the beach. Ash crossed his arms and tried to think of a way around the issue, but right then, they suddenly heard a scream from the women's side of the changing room. Whipping around at the sound of the scream, Ash tensed up and felt concern flood his being. That was Giselle. He and Brock then took off with Pikachu and Bee for the women's end of the changing facility. Upon arriving, they saw a man with long dark hair, a beard and black sunglasses charging out of the changing area. He was dressed in tan shorts and a blue floral print island shirt. A few seconds later, Misty, whom was fully dressed in a red two-piece, ran out as well with Giselle right behind her. Only the brunette was wrapped in a long white towel and nothing else. Hey, what's wrong? Ash called out as he and Brock ran up to their two female companions. Misty, whom appeared completely red in the face, she was so furious, pointed after the fleeing man. Which all the people on the beach were watching with mixed expressions of confusion and slight concern. That pervert was hiding in one of the dressing stalls and had a camera under Giselle's side, watching her change. Brock and Ash spun around, but the black-haired boy immediately took action as he angrily pointed at the fleeing voyeur. I don't think so. Pikachu, use quick attack and then Thunderbolt after you catch him. Smirking at the prospect of getting some action, Pikachu gave the man a few more yards of a head start before widening his stance. Then, in an explosion of speed that sent sand flying in a cloud, the small electric type shot off down the beach in a blur of white and yellow. Kicking up a wall of sand on either side of him as the sheer speed of his charge almost knocked a few beachgoers off their feet. Within seconds, he was upon the fleeing pervert and zoomed around in front of him, halting the man in his place as Pikachu stopped just 3 feet in front of him. As the bearded lech lurched to a stop and saw the small little Pokémon glaring up at him, he smirked and let out a smug laugh. What are you gonna do, rat? Bite me on the ankle? Ha! Get out of my way before I step on you. The foolhardy pervert's laughter was abruptly cut short as Pikachu disappeared in a blur of speed and the very next instant, had his head buried into the gut of the man. Eyes bulging and mouth gaping open, his laughter was turned to gasping as spittle flew from his mouth. The man felt like his internal organs had just been violently shifted back toward his spine as he teetered on his heels and went to fall over. However, before he could hit the ground, Pikachu landed first and crackled his cheeks before unleashing a bolt of low-powered thunder at the foiled voyeur. As the bolt of weak electricity hit the man, it was still powerful and bright enough to be seen by most everyone nearby on the beach. Luckily for him though, Pikachu only zapped him for a few moments, lest he fry his brain to mush. After the electrical attack ended, the man dropped to the sand with blackened singe marks all over his body and smoke rising up off his half-charred beard. The camera he had used to film Giselle was lying fried next to his outstretched arm, and all he could do was open his mouth and release a puff of smoke. Okay. I give up. He gasped as his body gave phantom spasms of pain from the electricity still coursing through his body. Ash and the others quickly ran up to him while the black-haired boy called out with a big grin. Great job, Pikachu. I think that was a new record. Turning to his trainer, Pikachu held up a peace sign and chirped triumphantly back. Pikachu pie. As they all crowded around the singed and smoking changing room voyeur, Misty sneered down at him. Ha! That's what you get for being such a disgusting pervert. You gross, hairy, peeping creepo. Giselle, who had her towel wrapped firmly around her frame, glared disapprovingly down at the twitching pervert. You should be ashamed of yourself spying on women like that. You're just pathetic, you're totally pathetic. At that moment, they suddenly heard a whistle blowing from somewhere behind them and turned back to see an Officer Jenny running their way with her Growlithe trailing behind her. Alright, what's going on? Everybody break it up. Break it up. She ran up to them and stopped next to Ash and Pikachu, looking down at the near unconscious man in the sand before snapping her head up and glaring at the kids. Okay, who did this? Using Pokémon to attack beachgoers and start fights is illegal and I'll take anyone to jail for breaking that law. Now fess up. Even Brock knew when to keep his sappy love spiels to himself in the face of an angry Officer Jenny, though Misty quickly attempted to explain. You don't understand, Officer Jenny, this man is a pervert. The blue-haired woman stopped and blinked. What? Explain what you mean by that. Holding her towel tighter against her body, Giselle spoke up as she looked at the female officer. We were in the changing rooms and this guy was in one of the stalls spying on me with a camera. See? She then pointed down at the ruined camera in the sand that Pikachu had destroyed. Ash, meanwhile, attempted to explain things from their end. He was trying to get away after spying on my girlfriend, so I had my Pikachu chase him down and stop him, officer. The blue-haired enforcer looked down at the man and glared. Is this true? Wanting nothing more than to just get taken far away from the scary little Pikachu that had fried him, the man gave a jerky nod and stammered back. Why yes. Just please take me away from that little yellow monster. Frowning in disgust, Jenny pulled out the handcuffs from her side and held them up. Then in that case you are under arrest for disturbing the peace, invasion of privacy and illegal voyeurism. Growlithe then jumped at the man, growling and baring his fangs to ensure he didn't try anything, while Officer Jenny knelt down to roll him over and handcuff him. Though they had no reason to worry, resisting arrest was the last thing on his mind. Ash and his friends smiled in satisfaction as the busted voyeur got what was coming to him, and when Jenny stood up, she looked apologetically at them. I'm sorry I accused the four of you. There was a disturbance and when I came and saw your Pikachu with a man laying on the ground, I thought you were just a bunch of troublemakers. You have my apologies though, you four performed a great public service by getting this degenerate off the beach. Thank you. As she stood up and directed the shaky man to his feet, Ash suddenly had a thought and then asked of the pretty female police officer. Excuse me, Officer Jenny, we have a lot of Pokémon with us that we would like to let out on the beach, but it's too crowded around here. Do you know of any place on the island that's a little more private? Jenny looked at him and then thought for a few seconds before smiling. Actually, I do. There's a beach on the southern end of the island that no one hardly ever goes to. It's mostly because that beach is in the same direction that the second of the Seafoam Islands is in. She raised her hand and finished her explanation. The waves are always a lot rougher for some reason and the water stays colder there than it does on this end of the island. So, the tourists mostly avoid it. Only locals typically go there and it isn't often. Sharing a look with his friends at the promising sounding location, Ash nodded and then glanced back to Officer Jenny. Thank you, Officer Jenny, we'll try it out. She gave a smile in return. You're welcome. If you just go back up onto the road and get on Conch Street a few blocks down, it'll take you all the way to the other side of town. From there you'll see a city limits sign and a little beyond that, you'll find a beach access road that goes through a small strip of forest. That's where you'll want to go to get back on the beach. After thanking her again and then seeing Officer Jenny march the handcuffed voyeur up the beach, Ash looked back at Giselle and nodded toward the changing room. Why don't you go get changed and then we'll head out to the beach Officer Jenny told us about. She smiled and readjusted the towel further up her chest. Yeah, now that Pikachu took care of that dirty old pervert, I can change in peace. She then knelt down and gently rubbed Pikachu behind the ears, softly smiling and thanking him for what he did, before making her way back over to the changing area again. Misty went with her, just to be safe, while Ash put his hands on his hips. Well, that was enough excitement for the day, right Brock? Not hearing a reply though, he looked over at